Alrighty, let's go ahead and talk about Arielle. I don't want to, but there seems to be a lot of videos on her channel about people detransitioning, and I wanted to go ahead and take a look at those numbers, figure out maybe why those are there, because if what she says in her videos is to be believed, then a whole bunch, apparently enough trans people detransition that we should give a shit. So, let's go ahead and get to the fan art section, and then we will go ahead and talk about what it is she wants to have us look at. So, fan art for today is... That is not the right button. That was just not the right button. I clicked the very wrong button. I'm kinda dumb. Sorry about that. Sorry. Anyway, fan art for today is from JacandQuil, and it is an updated piece from earlier. Said this is the very work-friendly, not safe to show at work? Whatever could you mean? This is, again, a piece that was done earlier, but more updated, more colored, more fun. As always, thank you for your fan art submissions. If you want your fan art to be shown in a future video, the best way to do so is drop it in the fan art section of the Discord. And with that said, the title of the video we're looking at is Thousands of, quote, trans teens want to detransition. And then it says women, lesbians, and homophobia. So let's see what she has to say.
From 2010 to 2017, females identifying as...
Oh boy, that's 2 times speed. Okay, nope.
From 2010 to...
And that is too loud.
2017, females identifying as trans skyrocketed in comparison to males. I have talked about this on my channel before, and now enough time has passed. We are finally seeing the effects of it all. Thousands of women all over the internet are now coming out, raising their voices about being detransitioned. They're making videos, they're writing articles. So why is this all happening, and why are the more woke trans activists insistent on hiding this all? Here are my thoughts.
Wait. Are there really woke trans activists insistent on hiding the fact that some people detransition? Like, okay, I figured it'd be common knowledge that there are a handful, not many, but a handful of people who, when experiencing gender dysphoria, decide that they want to transition, and then they find out later that they don't want to. Now, granted, we know it's only a small handful because I decided I would go ahead and look up some of the information on this. So before Arielle goes into her whole thing, from what I found is there's a 2015 survey that says that 8% of people detransition at some point. Now, here's the thing, though. That's at some point. That does not necessarily mean that they maintained that. The majority of the people who did detransition, though, later ended up living as a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth later. So, I guess, retransitioned. What? That's interesting. So what that tells me is that, yes, there may be a handful of people who detransition, but at the same time, there are most of those people who do detransition end up transitioning again later. Now, why do people detransition? That is another question entirely. So let's go ahead and poison that well here. A new study published in LGBT Health found that 13% of currently identified transgender people have detransitioned at some point in their lives, but that 82.5% of those who have detransitioned attribute their decision to at least one external factor, such as pressure from family, non-affirming school events, and increased vulnerability to violence, including sexual assault. The study was authored by researchers at the Fenway Institute of Massachusetts General Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and is believed to be the first rigorous study of the factors that drive transgender and gender-diverse people to detransition. Now, this information was made public in 2021, which means that this video that was made, what was it, 2020, I believe, would have been made without any of this information. This information had not been available in the same way. We had some studies dating back to 2015, the ones I cited before, but even then, there was a high rate of people retransitioning afterwards. So now that we know all that, let's go ahead and watch the video and see in what ways this information gets misconstrued.
More people are coming out as trans because the meaning of what trans is has changed. At one time, transgender meant somebody that lived full-time as the opposite sex without necessarily going physically through the transition. Man to woman, woman to man. Now it's such a broad definition that every single gay and lesbian alive fits it.
No. That's not how that works. Yes, the label of trans has been broadened. It did used to mean that people had actually medically transitioned. Now it's more understood that trans just means not identifying with the label you were given at birth. Like that's it. That's it. You're cis, you identify with the label you were given at birth. You're trans, you do not identify with the label you were given at birth. That's really all it is. Okay? That is functionally all it is. Now, I understand that there's confusion there, and I have pointed out years ago that one of the reasons for that confusion is trans sounds like it is short for transition, so people go, if you're not transitioning, how are you trans? Despite the fact that we're meaning trans more in the Latin sense, where it just means, to go above or beyond something, so you're beyond your original gender. I know it gets confusing, but once you have that idea down, once you get it, it's not that hard to understand. Like, once you understand that we don't mean trans as short for transitioned, then things kind of fall into place like Lego blocks. At least I would hope so. And if not, then, I guess at that point you could just step on Lego blocks.
By the way, this is not some random source. This is the American Psychological Association. Ready for this?
Ready for her to misconstrue it, too?
Transgender, an adjective that is an umbrella term used to describe the full range of people whose gender identity and or gender role do not conform to what is typically associated with their sex assigned at birth. So, what that means to me, as a lesbian, I'm a woman who dates women, I am not conforming to gender roles as a woman because I'm expected as a female person, woman person, I'm expected to date men.
No, that's not what that means. Your attraction and your identity are two very different concepts. Nobody is confusing these things. You are deliberately confusing them. Kitterdoodle, thank you very much for redeeming your points for an owl. But I'm sorry. I have never, ever, except in this one instance, with one person who has a history of being a dick where trans people are concerned, I have only in this instance encountered the argument being lesbian means you're trans. I have never heard it. I have never, until now. Let me know in the comment section if you've heard this weird version of that argument, because I haven't. This is my first time, and I'm very embroiled in this particular discourse.
So, therefore, I'm not conforming to gender roles, so therefore I am trans? No. And number two...
Okay, yeah, no. You're right that no, that's not right, but you're wrong in the reasons why.
Overwhelmingly overdiagnosing of people with gender dysphoria, known as rapid onset gender dysphoria, because doctors are afraid of being called transphobic. Yes, that is a thing we are talking about in 2020.
Wait, hold on. Since its formation in October, more than 300 women who regret transitioning from female to trans have come forward for support and advice. It's an extraordinary number, perhaps not so surprising when you see them the past 10 years. There's been a rise in people who believe that they're trans, 3/4 of whom are girls. A quick search of crowdfunding GoFundMe shows more than... Yeah, no. Okay, so, hold on. Wait. You understand that there was also a hugely significant rise of people who were homosexual. Like, literally, as being gay was more accepted in society, there was a drastic rise in people who identified as homosexual, and there was an even more drastic rise in people who identified themselves as homosexual from a very, very young age. Because as you normalize these things, people are more willing to both talk about them, explore them, and be open about them. Now, so this is more bizarre than the JoJo series. Always is, always will be. So the other thing that I need to point out here is, yes, a lot of people are coming forward showing that they, regret transitioning from female to male. But again, we have that more recent study. We have that more recent information that, to be fair, Arielle did not have access to. But there was other information that showed that they retransitioned later anyway, available in 2015. So I can't give full credit because there still was info available at that point. Point is, yes, there are people who are coming forward and detransitioning, but at the same time, of those people who are detransitioning, we know that the vast majority of them are either retransitioning later in life, or the reason they detransitioned in the first place was not because they had an internal struggle that said that, oh no, I need to I made a mistake. They didn't like the fact that violence was being done to them. They didn't like the fact that all kinds of other shit was being done to them that negatively affected their lives. That's what was happening. But, let's continue.
Since its formation in October, more than 300 women who regret transitioning from female to trans male have come forward for support and advice. In the UK, during the last 10 years, there has been a 3,200% rise in children who believe they have gender dysphoria. 75% of those are female people. When you go on GoFundMe, 26,000 girls, or people that are female, are seeking money to have top surgery. That's an obscene amount of people. And to parallel this, there is a ridiculous...
So, okay, 26,000 people is an obscene amount of people until you consider the fact that in the United States, that is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent. 26,000 people is a lot until you spread it across a population of 360 million. It's even less when you add in the populations of Canada and the UK, which this study is obviously looking at as well, because it's not just using United States numbers. Like, it's an obscene amount of people until you put it in context of all the other amounts of people who are there. Also, the most of the GoFundMe pages are for medical expenses, period. So, again, this is actually not that shocking in any way, shape, or form.
Ridiculous amount of doctors that are now leaving clinics that they worked for because they don't agree with the practices. And there's a video for this, so we're gonna watch that now.
What gender am I? It's something many young people are now asking.
The gender of my brain doesn't match up the gender of my biological sex.
And it's become a deeply divisive issue.
I had to stop the train and was like, okay, this isn't right, what we're doing here. So if you're watching my videos for the first time, my current stance on trans-related topics or trans issues is that yes, like actual transgender people are real. There are plenty of people out there who identify as the sex opposite of which they were born as, but
It doesn't have to be opposite, it just has to not be identifying with the one you were born as. That is the criteria. You've already got that wrong.
Also think that more people think that they are trans than actually are. I think that most of these kids...
How did you know that? How did you figure that information out? Did you get into each individual person's head like Carnage did in Absolute Carnage when he got himself into like Bruce Banner's brain? Did you do that? Was that a thing that you managed to do? Because like... unless you were able to get into their brain, unless you were able to weasel your way into their mind, you don't have evidence that they are wrong. You just think that because of your shoe.
And teenagers who identify as trans right now either have body dysmorphia or other mental illnesses that are underlying that psychologists don't care to examine or just don't go into depth with it because they're afraid of being labeled transphobic.
Do you have evidence of that either? I guess we'll find out.
So some of these people also might have trauma, and some are just doing it for the oppression points and because it is in right now. But yeah, I do believe...
Okay, so while there might be some people who do label themselves as trans so that they are seen as more woke on Twitter or some shit, again, the percentage of people that you would find in that actual category are so astronomically low. Like, 99% of the time when somebody identifies somebody else externally as a trender, which is what you're basically arguing there, when somebody does that, what they find is that that person, like remember the Riley Dennis situation where Blair White was labeling Riley a trender for, a couple years, and then finally it came out that no, Blair was wrong, like really fucking wrong. Riley just wasn't divulging her personal medical information to the entire world and had actually been going through the transition and everything, but there was no way for Blair to have known that. So Blair did the exact same fucking thing that this person's doing here and pretended that they could read the minds of every other trans person. And in so doing, in so pretending that you have the ability, like a nigh omniscient deity, to get into the brain of every single person and extract the information about their identity from them, you come to this weird conclusion that there's just so many people who are doing this. Let me be clear. If there's 20,000 people who label themselves as trans on Twitter who are not actually trans, then this person would freak out and say, oh my god, it's so many people! It's such a huge number! But then when you actually look at the numbers of people who use Twitter, you find that, again, we're down to a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of that user base. It sounds like an astronomical number when you don't pit it against the other amounts of people that are there. There's no reason to freak out here. A handful of people who use a label for nefarious purposes does not invalidate other people who use the label legitimately, and it also does not give you the authority to determine who or who is not using that label nefariously.
I believe that actual trans people with gender dysphoria exist, but let's continue with the video.
Wait. You don't have to have gender dysphoria to be trans, okay? Again, the entire criterion, the top to bottom of it, is, do you identify as the gender you were assigned at birth? It could be for a variety of reasons. It does not need to be that you experience dysphoria, because that assumes that being trans is to suffer, and that at some point when you transition, you stop being trans somehow, magically, because you've stopped suffering in that way, despite the other forms of suffering you might encounter. See the reasons that are cited for detransition earlier in the video. The idea that you must have gender dysphoria in order to be trans is a fairly ludicrous one when you actually talk to people who are trans for long periods of time. And not... Even when you take into account the things that are said by people like Blair White, when you watch Blair White's videos, what you find is she's speaking from a very small anecdotal place. When you factor her anecdotal place in with other people, you find that there are plenty of people who are trans who don't have dysphoria. And there's nothing wrong with that. Jesus Christ.
Can't ever be seen to be a service that can pronounce with great confidence about every young person who comes along. Nobody can do that.
So this video is by Sky News, and it talks about the overdiagnosing of trans people or trans children specifically in the UK at this one specific gender clinic.
Sky News research suggests 35 psychologists have resigned from the Children's Gender Service in London in the last 3 years.
35 psychologists in the last 3 years? Holy shit, 35? Because I don't think there's gonna be 35 psychologists in this place, unless it's tremendous. So what that means is people are coming and going, and coming and going. There's...
Do you have numbers for the amount of psychologists who work at that clinic? Because if you don't have numbers for the amount of people who are working at that clinic, then how do you know that 35 is a large or a small number? Moreover, how do you know that the 35 psychologists who are there, who are saying the things that they are saying that because of, like, legitimate psychological reasons, or are they saying that because of political reasons? Like, I hate to tell you this, but if this is happening in the UK, UK is fucking Turf Island right now. Like, at the end of the day, if there is a location right now that I would say is progressive enough for me to consider, but has that one fucking dead horse issue, for the United States it would be vaccines, and for the UK it would be trans people.
Oh my god, okay. So 35 psychologists left in the last 3 years.
We've managed to contact 20 of them. Only 6 would speak to us. All 6 said they were concerned about giving hormone treatment to children with gender dysphoria. All 6 felt they weren't able to properly explore underlying psychological factors.
All the 6 psychologists or psychiatrists that were willing to speak about this didn't feel that they were given proper time and proper effort to diagnose these patients.
Looking back, there are young people who I now wouldn't necessarily put on medication or sign off on medication.
This was the only clinician prepared to be interviewed. They asked us to change their voice.
I was once working with an executive that felt the gender dysphoria a young person was presenting with was really strong, really intense. So she decided to put the young person forward for the hormone blocking treatment after 2 appointments.
2 appointments?
Looking back, it was a young person with a history of trauma and
Wait. Let's take a look here. Let's take a look here. How many appointments to get puberty blockers? How many do we usually have here? Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba. Ba-da-ba-da-ba. Does anybody actually have that particular bit of information? And yeah, no, getting a single person for interview is not going to be enough. But how many appointments do we usually have to get puberty blockers? Let me go ahead and look here real quick. How many puberty blockers work? We know how they work. We do know that there are side effects. At what age can you start taking them? Every child is different. In general, starting puberty blockers leads to better outcomes and prevent lifelong difficulties. Let's see here. If your child decides they want to develop characteristics of the sex they were assigned, they can simply stop taking the blockers. Yeah, we already know that. Depends on where you are. I said it was just one for me, but that's HRT, not puberty blockers. And I'd been in therapy and living as a man for years. Fair enough. Even so, though, because we know how puberty blockers work, even that doesn't bother me too terribly much. Because here's the thing. Puberty blockers are reversible. Do you know how you reverse puberty blockers? You just stop taking them. Like, that's it. They buy time. If you were on puberty blockers for a couple years and then you decide, hey, actually, I don't want to transition, that's all it takes. Like, you just stop taking them, and then boom, you're done. And yeah, like, looking at sample size, of the 30 people that left, apparently, or of the 35 people who left, they contacted 20 of them, only 6 were able to comment, and they interviewed 1. That's not a sample size I give a shit about. Like, that's not a sample size that I give a shit about at all in any kind of research. Said here, most recent info from Armor and Quills. Most recent info I can see for the Travistock Trust is 449 full-time employees, losing 30-ish psychologists in multiple years. Doesn't really sound like a huge red flag. Okay? Fair enough.
Direct trauma in terms of abuse.
Oh, no. Okay, see, this is exactly what I thought. A lot of the time, these people that are being diagnosed with gender dysphoria don't have gender dysphoria, and they have a history of trauma or mental illness.
That's not what was said. That's not what was said. What was said isn't that they don't... Okay, listen here, you absolute fucking idiot. You can have gender dysphoria and also have a history of trauma. There being a history of trauma in an individual does not mean that they did not experience gender dysphoria. That's not what that means. That's never what that means. What? You didn't hit your smoking gun, dumbass!
Not that that isn't also valid, but it's not the same thing and should not be treated the same way.
They're not being treated the same way. What? Nobody has said that. That wasn't said in the video. That's not been said in the article. What?
And also there were other things happening to them, and this was not really explored by the clinician.
These views were echoed by others who had worked at the clinic. Therapy is not an option in this service, one psychologist told us.
They don't even offer therapy at this place?
This is Thomason. She's...
Wait. Therapy is not an option there? That sounds weird. That sounds weird. I actually don't know how to feel about that one.
Just told us.
They don't even offer therapy at this place?
This is Thomason. She's 19 years old and was born female. She previously identified as male, but detransitioned earlier this year.
Sorry, this is random, but can we talk about the tattoo that she has, the valid tattoo? It's kind of ironic now, isn't it?
The whistleblower says they saw
It's so ironic that you used it in the thumbnail of this video. That's, still weird.
many female-born patients with underlying issues, such as experiences of homophobia, or even a history of abuse.
Literally what I've been saying for the last 5 years that I've been talking about trans things. The reason I feel like I have the right to talk about these things
is because you're an idiot and you suffer from Dunning-Kruger. JacandQuil, in all caps, in the chat, a psychiatrist doesn't do therapy, they do medication. Ah. Right. Didn't think about that. Literally, there's a difference between therapy and psychiatry. Like, this... Two different categories. Two different categories. Psychiatrists do not do therapy. They do meds. They do meds, and they do control of meds. I should know this. I've been to a therapist, and I've been to a psychiatrist. Jesus Christ.
If I don't have a trans person in the video with me, is because I think that a lot of these people, a lot of these women think that they are trans because of exactly this. Internalized homophobia, sexism, misogyny, all of these things, trauma, mental illness.
The numbers started growing from 2012 when we started seeing more females coming forward, and this has happened across the Western world.
And as a psychologist, did you ever feel that you could say to a parent, I don't believe your child is trans?
Well, you largely wouldn't know. Your job is not to go, I do believe or I don't believe you're trans. Your job is to go, hey, here are the steps we would take so that you can figure out if you're trans.
No, and this is one of the reasons why I decided to leave the service, because as a psychologist, I felt that if I ever spoke to a family like this, I would immediately be called transphobic.
Wait, you felt that, but did it happen to you? I'm sorry. I have to ask the question, did you feel it or did it happen to you? Because if you feel it, that's one thing that I just don't care about. But if it actually happened to you, if you actually dealt with a family, you know, calling you transphobic, for one, you should be able to handle that. You're a professional. Come on. Buckle the fuck up. Secondly, if it's actually happened to you, that is at the very least more valid of a concern than I felt it might happen to me. There are people paranoid about shit all the time, for no reason.
Imagine being a doctor in one of these clinics, knowing that someone that you're treating or trying to help isn't experiencing gender dysphoria.
How would you know that? How would you, as the doctor, know that? The child is the one who knows that, not you. I'm sorry, unless you have the ability to read someone's mind.
But you're terrified of being shamed and called transphobic because of the proper diagnosis, which is why you're a doctor. Oh my god, like, these are all things that I thought would happen that are happening now.
A record number.
Except half of these things you've gotten wrong. Half of these things you've just gotten wrong, though.
Number of young people are being referred to the Children's Gender Service at the Tavistock. There were just 77 patients referred here 10 years ago. By last year, the number had climbed to 2,590 children.
Yes, because, again, as trans issues become an issue of visibility, as people realize that being trans is more normal, and as it is normalized, you expect there to be an increase, at the very least, even a sudden increase, of people thinking that they might be. Now, here's the thing. My prediction, and maybe my prediction's wrong, my prediction is within about 30 years, these numbers will go back down a little bit. And it doesn't mean that fewer people are actually trans. That's not what it means. What it means is people get more of an understanding of what it means to be trans, and as a result, there will be fewer false positives. That is my personal prediction. But I will go ahead and say that it is pulled entirely out of my ass.
The majority female at birth, and they've told us around 3,000 more children are on the waiting list.
It's a shame that the overt wokeness of people, at least in the Western world, are making more people think that they are trans, therefore making the waiting list of children and people that are actually trans insanely long.
So, wait a minute, hold on. Are you saying that the majority of the people who are getting treatment now aren't, and therefore the people who are actually trans are stuck on the waiting list? Because the only way that statement would make sense is if you had the data to tell me how many people on the waiting list weren't trans, and the data to tell me how many people weren't, or were actually getting treatment were or were not trans. If you don't have that information, then this observation's pulled out of your rectum.
Like 3,000 people on the waiting list. Probably like 75% of those people aren't actually trans anyway. But
how do you know that? How did you come to that conclusion? By what method did you source that data? Or is it, like my previous prediction, pulled right out the butt? Also, how's it going, Bonbon? No overlay, yes.
Still, like, you should be able, if you are experiencing actual gender dysphoria, you should be able to walk in and talk to a therapist immediately. Insane.
That was a
Okay, so here's the thing. It's not necessarily insane. Like, the NHS in general has waiting lists. It's a problem with the NHS as it is at the moment. It's one, and from what I understand from my conversations with some of my friends who are in the UK, a lot of that also comes down to the fact that they're being underfunded. Like, there are politicians who are underfunding them so that they can try to force more privatized healthcare happening in the UK. Again, that's from conversations that I've had. That is not something that I have data to present right now on. But waiting lists are a problem there. But they're a problem for everything. Pointing out that they're a problem where trans people are concerned, it doesn't change the fact that everybody's having those issues.
Turning point for Luke, and he set up a phone consultation with a GP he found online. They prescribed him testosterone, which he now applies as a cream. He's essentially changing his body himself.
Did they just say that they prescribed him testosterone without even meeting him? Like, they just talked to him on the phone?
What is the difference between talking to somebody on the phone and talking to them in person? I don't know. Anyway, again, pointing it out where the article's concerned is one thing, but again, you want data. These are not conclusions that one can reach just by watching a single video. These are things that somebody needs to be looking at data for. It's a gel, not cream. I don't know why, but that bugged me. Fair enough. But yeah, no, I don't know the exact situation that the individual that she showed was in that led them to get a prescription. I don't know. But the conclusions that seem to be trying to be reached in the video are that there's such a massive amount of people who are getting these prescriptions that they're clogging up these lines, and that the majority of them don't need them, or that the majority of them are not trans in some way, shape, or form. And again, a lot of this relies on a gross misunderstanding of what trans actually is. Like, remember, the beginning of the video was her literally saying, by this definition, me being a lesbian makes me trans. Again, what the fuck? So, if it's just going to be her reading that article, or not reading, but watching that video for the entire time, and just getting shocked and saying, look, I was right, whilst also being very, very wrong on multiple things, then I don't really care much to watch more of the video. What we are going to do real quick, and I thought I had it up here. Let's go ahead and read this article and take a look at some of the information here. So, we already read the first paragraph of this. New study shows discrimination, stigma, and family pressure drive detransition among transgender people. These findings show that detransition and transition regret are not synonymous, despite the two phenomena being frequently conflated in the media and in political debates, said Dr. Jack Turbin, fellow in child and adolescent psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine and lead author of the study. For most people, it appears detransition is forced upon them. Our results highlight the extreme barriers transgender people in the U.S. face when trying to live their lives authentically. A growing body of literature shows that exposure to discrimination and stigma increases the risk of poor mental health outcomes among transgender and gender-diverse people. But findings from factors leading to detransition among transgender and gender-diverse people in the United States, a mixed method analysis, suggests that stigma and discrimination should also be understood as obstacles to safe living in one's gender identity and expression. The study also buttresses public statements by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Association of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the American Public Health Association opposing the 82 bills that have been filed in a majority of states this year that would contribute to the external factors that lead to detransition, such as making it illegal to provide gender-affirming healthcare to children and teenagers, or restricting transgender students' access to public school facilities and or participation in school activities. The study uses data from the 2015 Transgender Survey, conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality. Hey, that was actually a source that we looked at a little earlier, I believe, if I am correct. So pulls a few other studies in, gets them in here. So the survey is over 27,000 transgender people in all 50 states. Of the 17,000 transgender people surveyed who said they'd undergone the process of gender-affirming transition, 2,242 also said that they had detransitioned at some point in their lives. The most common reason cited for detransition was pressure from a parent, 35%, pressure from their community, 32%, or trouble finding a job, 26%. Other reasons included pressure from medical health professionals or religious leaders. Detransition was significantly associated with male sex assigned at birth, non-binary gender identity, or bisexual sexual orientation, which is consistent with prior research finding that the factors are associated with lower rates of societal acceptance. Only 2.4 transgender people who reported past detransition attributed this to doubt about their gender identity. And this is the difference between detransition and transition regret. Transition regret would include the doubt about the gender identity that you are moving into, while only 10% attributed their past detransition to fluctuations in gender identity or desire. Clinicians working with patients should evaluate all factors driving detransition and be aware that many of these factors, such as pressure from parents or other family members, may warrant clinical interventions such as family symptoms therapy. Factors leading to detransition among transgender teens and diverse people is the latest in a series of papers from the same authors using data from the 2015 Transgender Survey. And that is about the end of the article there. So what can we get in conclusion here? We do know that there are people who validly experience transition regret. We do know that there are people who end up detransitioning. But the numbers show that the vast majority of people who transition end up sticking with it. And the majority of people who detransition don't do it because they wanted to. They do it because they needed to get more access to jobs. They needed to do it because there was societal acceptance issues. Basically stuff that we do have the ability to change over time. Like, at the end of the day, social zeitgeist is completely and totally in our control. Not insofar as a handful of people can change it, but it only changes because the people in that society change. Period. There are some ludicrous things said in here, like trans meaning that you're lesbian, which nobody believes, from what I understand, except for, I guess, Arielle. And then, at the very least, she was pulling from what seemed to be a somewhat unbiased source, but instead of looking at the actual data and just reporting on what her knee-jerk reaction was to the things she saw in the video, I cannot recommend that as a valid way to come to conclusions. I just can't. But that said, I guess here's where I throw the ball back into your court. So that's a pretty common curve narrative about transing the lesbians. Yeah, I've seen that talking point a handful of times. I have. I guess some things to be made aware of. We said it in the video. I'll say it again here at the end. If you have been paying attention to what's going on in the UK, there is a lot of turfy nonsense going on within those borders right now anyway. Just like there's doctors who are leaving hospitals because they're being forced to take a vaccine so that they don't end up harming their patients. That does not mean that the efficacy of a vaccine is bad or to be worried about on our particular front. Just like a handful of psychologists leaving over at the NHS does not suddenly mean that the issue that they're leaving over is even a legitimate one. For that, we don't look at a handful of psychologists leaving an area. That's not a smoking gun. are smoking gun is actual studies, actual statistics, not big numbers that are very scary. Yeet the anti-vaxxers out of the hospital with trebuchet if possible. Oh my god. Anyway, here's where I throw it back to you guys. What did you guys think of the article itself and everything else here? I want to know. With that said, though, I am going to hop out of this particular video because it's gone on way too long. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the follow button if you haven't already. And as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here. Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. It really means a lot to me. If you want access to behind-the-scenes content for the channel, please consider checking out my Patreon. I do weekly vlogs over there where I give real-life updates to what's going on behind the scenes on the channel, stuff that you don't really get over here and even on Twitch. Patreon also helps the channel's stability a whole lot. Without Patreon, I wouldn't be able to do this at all. Especially with the kind of content that I do, neither YouTube nor Twitch are the most stable sources of income. If you are a $20 and up patron, then you will be featured on the ending slides as shown in the beginning of the end credits. If you want to catch the streams where all this content comes from, then consider heading over to Twitch and following. And if you want to continue watching over here on YouTube, maybe consider clicking one of the end screen videos. And once again, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with me over on my channel. I wouldn't be able to do literally anything that I'm doing over here on YouTube without each and every one of you. So, thank you.